Ladies and gentlemen, the arc of progress bends not through silence, but through reasoned discourse. In this age of wokeness, where moral clarity sometimes overshadows nuance, the challenge is not whether we care, but how wisely we express that care. Progress is not a myth, it's measurable. Fewer wars, longer lives, more rights. Yet, amid all this, the institutions that once celebrated open inquiry, yes, even Harvard, now wrestle with the tension between activism and academic freedom. Wokeness must balance moral passion with intellectual openness. This idea touches on a central dilemma in modern intellectual life, the tension between a heightened moral sensitivity to injustice and the need to preserve the traditions of open inquiry, skepticism, and debate. The term, wokeness, originally a positive descriptor of social awareness, has in recent years become polarizing. For some, it represents a necessary reckoning with systemic injustices that were too long ignored. For others, it has become synonymous with a rigid, censorious culture in which dissent is pathologized and nuance is flattened. Whatever one's stance, it is undeniable that the rise of wokeness reflects a deep moral passion, a collective desire to reduce harm, elevate the marginalized, and make society more equitable. But that passion, untempered, can collide with the principles that make progress sustainable: critical thinking, tolerance of dissent, and openness to error correction. Human cognition is limited. We are prone to biases, tribalism, and motivated reasoning. One of the great achievements of Enlightenment thought, and by extension modern liberal democracies and academic institutions, has been the recognition of these cognitive limits and the design of environments that counteract them. Science, free speech, peer review, and the adversarial clash of ideas, all these are mechanisms not for amplifying certainty, but for controlling error. They rest on the assumption that no one, no movement, no ideology, and no generation possesses a monopoly on moral truth. Intellectual openness is not the enemy of justice, it is its foundation. When wokeness drifts into orthodoxy, when it becomes allergic to critique, or when it reduces complex problems into binary moral narratives, it risks undermining the very goals it seeks to advance. Consider how young people today are trained to view certain ideas not as hypotheses to be tested, but as moral commitments to be defended at all costs. The difference is subtle but profound. If a student believes a proposition is true because it survived empirical testing, they remain open to changing their mind in the face of counter-evidence. But if they believe a proposition is good because it aligns with their moral tribe, then counter-evidence becomes a kind of moral threat. In this atmosphere, disagreement is no longer interpreted as intellectual friction. It is recast as harm, even violence. Professors who present data that challenge sacred narratives are not merely wrong, they are dangerous. Students who ask heterodox questions are not curious, they are problematic. The chilling effect is real, and it has measurable consequences on what gets published, what gets taught, and what can be said without social reprisal. This is not a defense of bigotry or ignorance. It is not a plea to return to a time when marginalized voices were excluded from the table. Quite the opposite. The value of including diverse perspectives is precisely that they increase the robustness of our collective understanding. But inclusion should not come at the cost of inquiry. A culture that encourages people to speak only if they are certain their words will be approved is not a culture of inclusion. It is a culture of fear. When moral passion hardens into dogma, it shuts down the very conversations that make democratic societies self-correcting and humane. We must also recognize that many of the gains associated with moral progress, civil rights, gender equality, LGBTQ recognition, did not come from suppressing speech, but from exposing it to reason. The case for same-sex marriage, for example, prevailed not because dissenters were silenced, but because advocates made a better, more persuasive argument in the public sphere. Progress is not a product of purity, it is a product of process. The moment we short-circuit that process in the name of righteousness, we risk undermining the trust in the institutions that deliver justice. It is easier to demand moral conformity than to do the hard work of persuasion. But moral shortcuts are unstable. They create resentment, drive dissent underground, and ultimately weaken the cause they aim to support. There is also a psychological component to this. People are drawn to movements that give them a sense of purpose and belonging. Wokeness, especially in its more extreme manifestations, often operates like a secular religion. It offers a narrative of sin privilege, salvation allyship, and heresy wrongthink. The rituals, calling out, canceling, virtue signaling, mirror the dynamics of puritanical systems. This is not inherently bad. Humans crave meaning. But when moral belonging becomes contingent on intellectual conformity, it shuts down the conditions that allow belief systems to evolve and adapt. Open societies flourish not by suppressing passions, but by channeling them through institutions that demand evidence, argument, and respect for dissent. Educational institutions have a special responsibility here. Universities are not supposed to be ideological training grounds, they are supposed to be laboratories for thinking. If they become echo chambers in which certain viewpoints are presumed to be correct before they are examined, they betray their mission. The goal is not to teach students what to think, but how to think. That includes how to navigate uncomfortable ideas, how to challenge assumptions, including their own, and how to separate moral outrage from empirical analysis. A truly inclusive intellectual culture does not protect people from ideas, it prepares them to engage with them, critique them, and build better ones. This is the path to wisdom, not ideological insulation. Moreover, balancing passion and openness does not mean a false equivalence between all ideas. Some arguments are indeed better than others. But the way to establish that is not through suppression, but through exposure. Bad ideas wither when exposed to sunlight, good ones strengthen through challenge. Shielding ideas from scrutiny doesn't protect truth. It makes it brittle. A belief that can't withstand challenge is not a belief, it's a dogma. And dogma, no matter how well-intentioned, is antithetical to progress. Social progress depends not just on caring about injustice, but on caring about truth. These goals are not in conflict, they are intertwined. A society that suppresses dissent in the name of morality is vulnerable to error, overreach, and regression. The question is not whether wokeness is wrong or right. The question is whether it can survive exposure to the norms of open debate. If it can, it deserves a place in our institutions. If it can't, then we must ask why a movement that claims to speak for justice fears the mechanisms that have historically served justice best: argument, evidence, and honest disagreement. Measurable progress counters pessimistic narratives. In an age dominated by rapid news cycles, social media outrage, and a deepening distrust in institutions, it is easy, almost natural, for people to believe that the world is getting worse. Stories of war, inequality, climate change, and political dysfunction flood our screens, leading many to feel overwhelmed and hopeless. But feelings are not facts, and when we take a step back from the emotional immediacy of the moment to examine long-term data, a different picture emerges, one that is not defined by decline, but by improvement. This is not a claim of utopia, nor is it a denial of suffering. It is a commitment to empiricism over sentiment, to trend lines over headlines. Consider the basic indicators of human welfare: life expectancy, infant mortality, extreme poverty, literacy, and violence. All of these, on a global scale, have improved dramatically over the past century. In 1800, over 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number is under 10%, despite a vastly larger global population. Child mortality has fallen from around 40% in pre-modern societies to less than 5% in most of the world. Life expectancy globally has more than doubled. These are not abstract statistics. They represent billions of lives saved, extended, and enriched. Education is another area where progress is measurable. In the early 20th century, the majority of the world's population was illiterate. Now, global literacy rates have surpassed 85%. Girls, once systematically excluded from schooling in many parts of the world, are now attending primary and secondary school in nearly equal numbers to boys in most countries. Access to higher education has expanded dramatically, opening doors for innovation, mobility, and self-determination. This transformation has not been evenly distributed or free from setbacks, but the overall trend is clear and encouraging. Healthcare has undergone a revolution. Vaccines have eradicated or sharply reduced the toll of deadly diseases such as smallpox, polio, measles, and malaria. Medical treatments and diagnostics that were science fiction a few decades ago are now commonplace. Deaths from infectious diseases have plummeted, and survival rates for cancer, heart disease, and HIV have improved. The COVID-19 pandemic, while tragic, also demonstrated humanity's capacity for rapid scientific response, with mRNA vaccines developed and distributed at unprecedented speed. Violence, contrary to popular belief, has also declined over the long term. Rates of homicide, domestic violence, and war-related deaths are all significantly lower than in past centuries. The 20th century, often cited as uniquely violent due to 2 world wars, also marked the beginning of a steady decline in interstate warfare. Despite civil conflicts and regional violence that still cause immense suffering, the average person today is far less likely to die from war or violence than at almost any point in history. This is not the result of fate. It is the consequence of institutions, norms, and the spread of liberal democratic governance. The rights revolution is another testament to measurable progress. Over the last century, and especially since the 1960s, there has been a global expansion of civil rights, political representation, and legal protections for historically oppressed groups. Slavery, once practiced in nearly every civilization, has been legally abolished. Women now vote, own property, and lead nations in countries where they were once treated as chattel. LGBTQ individuals, once criminalized, now enjoy legal recognition and social acceptance in a growing number of regions. While discrimination persists, the direction of change has been toward inclusion, not exclusion. Even environmental awareness and action, though often framed in apocalyptic terms, show signs of progress. Many developed nations have begun to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions. Technological advances in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and sustainable agriculture suggest that solutions to environmental challenges are not only possible but underway. The Montreal Protocol, which successfully curtailed the use of ozone-depleting substances, stands as proof that coordinated international action can reverse ecological damage. The path forward is complex, but it is not hopeless. So why, despite all this, does the narrative of decline dominate? One reason lies in our cognitive biases. Humans are wired to pay attention to threats. Bad news grabs our attention more than good news, a phenomenon known as negativity bias. This served us well in evolutionary environments where danger often meant death. But in the information-saturated modern world, it leads to a distorted perception of reality. Media outlets incentivized to attract attention amplify rare but emotionally charged events. As a result, people come to believe that rare dangers, mass shootings, terrorist attacks, economic collapses, are more common than they are. Another factor is the moral intuition that equates concern with pessimism. To care about injustice is often interpreted as insisting that things are worse than ever. But this confuses moral vigilance with historical ignorance. We can and must acknowledge injustice without denying improvement. In fact, the very ability to recognize and condemn injustices today is often a sign of moral progress. There was a time when no one thought to question the morality of slavery, domestic abuse, or capital punishment. The fact that we now do is itself a product of progress. Pessimism can also become a kind of moral performance. Declaring the world irredeemable can be a way of signaling one's seriousness or depth. But it risks demobilizing action. If people believe that nothing gets better, they are less likely to work for change. Conversely, recognizing progress does not mean complacency. It means understanding what has worked so we can do more of it. Historical awareness allows us to calibrate our strategies, build on past successes, and avoid repeating failed approaches. It is not naive to say things have improved, it is naive to ignore the evidence. Data, not ideology, must guide our understanding of the world. This does not mean statistics should replace compassion or that trends negate individual suffering. But if we want to solve problems, we must understand their scope and direction. Overstating problems can be just as damaging as ignoring them. It distorts priorities, fosters cynicism, and can lead to poorly designed policies. Realistic optimism, grounded in data and history, is not a feel-good slogan. It is a strategy for making informed decisions in an uncertain world. The case for measurable progress is not just academic, it is existential. Belief in the possibility of improvement is what sustains efforts to reform institutions, invent technologies, and mobilize movements. It provides a narrative of agency rather than despair. People are not powerless. We have changed the world before, and we are changing it now. To deny that is to erase the work of generations who fought, invented, healed, and taught in the service of a better future. Academic freedom is under pressure in elite institutions. The concept of academic freedom has long served as the cornerstone of higher education. It is what allows scholars to pursue truth wherever it leads, to explore controversial ideas without fear of retribution, and to challenge prevailing orthodoxies in pursuit of knowledge. Yet today, this foundational principle faces growing constraints, not necessarily from governments or authoritarian regimes, but from within academia itself, particularly in elite institutions, those most historically associated with the advancement of critical thought and scientific inquiry. There is increasing evidence of a shift from a culture of open debate to one of ideological conformity and social risk aversion. The ideal of a university is built upon the assumption that no idea is above scrutiny. Every proposition, however sacred or uncomfortable, should be evaluated based on its merits, its evidence, and its coherence. The process of intellectual inquiry thrives in a space where dissent is not only tolerated but encouraged. But this space is shrinking. Faculty members increasingly report censorship, avoidance of controversial topics, and pressure to conform to dominant narratives, not because of administrative mandates, but because of peer and student pressures that redefine the boundaries of acceptable speech. One of the primary drivers of this shift is the transformation of campus culture. Whereas previous generations of students might have viewed the university As a training ground for challenging ideas, many students today are taught to prioritize emotional safety over intellectual rigor. Concepts like safe spaces, microaggressions, and trigger warnings have reshaped classroom dynamics in ways that make certain discussions nearly impossible. Professors who introduce contested ideas, even with the intent of fostering debate, may face student complaints, viral social media campaigns, or formal investigations. This chilling effect discourages risk-taking and curtails the breadth of inquiry. Faculty hiring and promotion practices have also become entangled with ideological considerations. In some departments, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, it is increasingly difficult to advance in one's career without signaling adherence to specific political or theoretical frameworks. Statements on diversity, equity, and inclusion are now often mandatory in hiring and grant applications, and while the intent behind these initiatives may be laudable, the implementation can become a form of ideological screening. Scholars who express dissenting views, or who merely fail to perform the right linguistic rituals, may find themselves excluded from professional opportunities. The peer review process, once a bulwark of academic rigor, is also vulnerable. Journals and conferences sometimes reject submissions not because the arguments are weak or the data flawed, but because the conclusions are deemed politically inconvenient. Editors and reviewers, conscious of reputational risk, may err on the side of caution, especially if a paper touches on sensitive issues such as race, gender, or immigration. The result is a narrowing of permissible discourse and the elevation of consensus over contestation. This undermines the very function of scholarship, which depends on the contest of ideas and the constant testing of assumptions. Student activism, while historically a powerful force for change, now often contributes to the pressure on academic freedom. Protest has evolved from a tool for holding power accountable to a mechanism for controlling speech. Demands for disinvitations, curriculum changes, and even firings are frequently issued in response to ideas or speakers that challenge prevailing views. Speakers with controversial opinions are labeled as threats to student well-being, and events are shut down preemptively to avoid conflict. The university, instead of acting as a steward of open dialogue, too often capitulates to the loudest voices, fearing reputational harm or campus unrest. Social media amplifies these dynamics. A single classroom comment, taken out of context, can be broadcast to thousands or millions, sparking outrage and demands for institutional action. The reputational economy of the internet punishes ambiguity, nuance, and intellectual exploration, rewarding instead moral certainty and outrage. Faculty and administrators, aware of the speed and severity of these firestorms, may preemptively restrict what is said or taught, not because they believe it is wrong, but because they fear the consequences. The threat is not state censorship. It is social punishment administered by the community itself. There is also a growing instrumental view of higher education that prioritizes activism and identity affirmation over inquiry and evidence. Some students arrive on campus expecting to be validated rather than challenged. They interpret disagreement not as engagement but as offense. Professors, increasingly evaluated by student satisfaction and public image, may cater to these expectations rather than maintain the demanding standards of critical thinking. This shift changes the role of education from an encounter with complexity to a performance of righteousness. It promotes intellectual fragility instead of resilience. Institutional leadership often exacerbates the problem. University administrators, wary of controversy and driven by public relations concerns, tend to adopt risk-averse strategies. Instead of defending faculty and upholding the principles of free inquiry, they may issue apologies, launch investigations, or impose vague codes of conduct that can be weaponized against dissenters. The result is a culture in which academics must constantly watch their words, not because their ideas are unsound, but because they might offend the sensibilities of a vocal minority. This is not a formula for intellectual vitality. It is a blueprint for stagnation. The long-term consequences of these trends are severe. Innovation requires the freedom to question prevailing assumptions, to challenge norms, and to propose radical alternatives. If elite institutions, the very places where intellectual risk should be most encouraged, become conformist and constrained, the pipeline of new ideas will shrink. The academy will cease to be a generator of knowledge and become a mechanism for preserving orthodoxy. Students, deprived of genuine debate, will be less prepared to navigate the complexities of the world. They will emerge not as thinkers, but as enforcers of consensus. Moreover, when academic freedom is curtailed in the name of justice or safety, it sets a precedent that others can exploit. Today's mechanisms of social enforcement may seem benign or well-intentioned, but they can be opted by any group with power and a grievance. What is considered offensive or harmful is often subjective and changeable. Once the principle of open inquiry is compromised, there is no stable ground on which to draw lines. Censorship, once normalized, rarely remains contained. Enlightenment values remain essential for honest discourse. These values, reason, evidence, skepticism, free speech, and the pursuit of truth, emerged as a transformative force in the 17th and 18th centuries, challenging dogma, authoritarianism, and the arbitrary use of power. They fueled revolutions in science, philosophy, politics, and human rights, laying the intellectual foundations for modern democracy, human progress, and academic freedom. Despite their historical success, these values are increasingly questioned or disregarded in contemporary discourse, especially in spaces where moral absolutism, tribalism, or identity politics dominate. Yet if society abandons Enlightenment principles, it risks losing the very mechanisms that enable moral and intellectual self-correction. At the heart of Enlightenment thought is the commitment to reason. Reason allows individuals to evaluate claims based on logic and coherence rather than emotion or tradition. It is the method by which disagreement becomes constructive rather than destructive, and where persuasion replaces coercion. In the absence of reason, discourse devolves into shouting matches, with each side asserting its truth without interest in understanding the other. Reason does not guarantee agreement, but it provides a shared framework for dialogue. When interlocutors appeal to rational arguments rather than personal offense or group loyalty, the potential for meaningful exchange increases dramatically. Closely allied to reason is evidence, the requirement that claims be supported by observable facts, reproducible data, and logical inference. In an era dominated by ideology and narrative-driven thinking, the demand for evidence is often subordinated to feelings or slogans. Yet without evidence, there is no way to adjudicate between competing claims, no way to discern which policies are effective and which are not, and no way to distinguish truth from fiction. Enlightenment thinkers insisted that beliefs must be tested against the world, not simply accepted because they are comforting, popular, or ideologically fashionable. Skepticism is another pillar of Enlightenment values. It functions as a guardrail against dogma, requiring individuals to question their own assumptions as vigorously as they question others. Skepticism is not cynicism, it does not reject knowledge, but rather insists that knowledge be earned through careful scrutiny. When skepticism is lost, belief becomes brittle. Movements, ideologies, and institutions that shield themselves from criticism often become intellectually stagnant and morally self-righteous. Skepticism encourages humility, the recognition that one might be wrong, that one's preferred theory may have flaws, and that even cherished beliefs must be open to challenge. Free speech, arguably the most contested Enlightenment value today, is essential not because all speech is valuable, but because the freedom to express unpopular or controversial ideas protects the conditions for discovery and reform. In the marketplace of ideas, falsehoods are exposed not through suppression, but through debate and counterargument. Attempts to suppress speech often backfire, driving bad ideas underground where they become harder to challenge and easier to mythologize. More importantly, restrictions on speech rarely stay confined to obviously harmful content. The definition of what constitutes hate, offense, or misinformation is fluid and often shaped by political power. Free speech protects not only those with mainstream opinions, but also dissenters, whistleblowers, and innovators. Honest discourse requires that individuals enter dialogue with the willingness to change their minds. Enlightenment values prioritize truth, seeking over victory seeking. In a culture where reputational incentives reward moral posturing, signaling loyalty to one's tribe, or dominating opponents in debate, honesty can become a liability. Yet genuine progress, whether scientific, moral, or political, depends on individuals being willing to abandon bad ideas when confronted with better ones. This is only possible in an environment where it is safe to admit uncertainty, revise one's views, and reward intellectual flexibility rather than punish it. The Enlightenment also introduced the idea of universalism, the belief that all humans are equal in moral worth and capable of reason. This principle stands in stark contrast to many modern ideologies that divide people into fixed identity categories, each with its own epistemology and moral standing. While identity and lived experience are important components of understanding social reality, they do not replace the need for shared standards of logic, evidence, and argument. When truth is treated as relative to identity, and when disagreement is seen as invalid, unless it comes from within a given group, the possibility of common understanding erodes. Enlightenment universalism does not erase difference, but it insists that difference does not preclude dialogue. In institutions of learning, Enlightenment values are especially crucial. Universities exist not to reinforce the beliefs of the moment, but to examine them. They are designed to host uncomfortable questions, to protect dissent, and to train students not only in what to think but in how to think. When universities drift away from these values, when they prioritize ideology over inquiry or social harmony over truth, they betray their mission. Students are shortchanged when they are taught that their emotional reactions determine the legitimacy of arguments. Faculty are constrained when they cannot pursue research that challenges dominant paradigms. Enlightenment values ensure that the pursuit of knowledge remains dynamic, not doctrinaire. Democratic governance also relies on Enlightenment principles. Policy debates must be grounded in reason and evidence, not propaganda or passion. Citizens must be informed, critical, and open to revising their views. Public discourse must be robust enough to withstand disagreement without descending into polarization or violence. Without these conditions, democracy degenerates into factionalism, demagoguery, and populist spectacle. The Enlightenment ideal of deliberative democracy, government by discussion rather than force, depends on citizens being equipped with the intellectual tools to weigh arguments, understand trade-offs, and tolerate dissent. The benefits of Enlightenment values are not limited to Western societies. They are not parochial or culturally contingent. Scientific reasoning, skepticism, human rights, and free expression have taken root in diverse contexts across the globe. The universality of these values lies in their procedural character. They are not a list of conclusions, but a method of arriving at conclusions. They can accommodate pluralism and adapt to local conditions without sacrificing their core commitment to truth, seeking, and intellectual integrity. In a world increasingly shaped by global challenges, climate change, pandemics, technological disruption, shared methods of inquiry and dialogue are more important than ever. Critics of Enlightenment thought often point to its historical blind spots, its complicity with colonialism, its exclusion of women and minorities, or its tendency toward rationalist overreach. These criticisms are important and worth grappling with. But the solution to Enlightenment failures is not to discard its values, but to apply them more consistently. It was the Enlightenment's own tools, self-criticism, reasoned argument, moral reflection, that enabled societies to recognize and rectify those injustices. The expansion of civil rights, the dismantling of colonial empires, the advancement of gender equality, all were made possible not by abandoning Enlightenment ideals, but by extending them.